All right. Well, today on the show, we're excited to talk to Dr. Alan Noble. Alan, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, Alan. Hey, before we dive in, could you just give us just tell us a little bit of your story and how you what led you to the place where you wrote this book, You Are Not Your Own.
Yeah, that's an important question. Yeah, so I teach composition and literature at Oklahoma Baptist University. I've spent a couple decades now being very passionate about trying to help the church engage and participate in culture in more biblical and robust and healthy ways. So I helped found a website called Christ in Pop Culture. And through that time working there and working with students, I've uh, grown to have a concern not just for popular culture and artifacts like books and novels and movies and such, but also just the way society functions. And when I wrote my first book called Disruptive Witness, I had when I went around and gave talks for it, because it's about the way technology distracts us and why this is harmful and how churches can address that. And one of the things that people would often ask me is they'd ask for like a strategy or a method to live the perfect digital life, right? So they'd say, "So Alan, tell me what's your, how do you deal with cell phone use and how do you do all these things right?" And one of the things I realized is that um, for a lot of people, they feel a tremendous burden to get things right, to have just the right method of using technology, have just the right method of parenting, of being a student, and so on and so forth. And that burden can be overwhelming. I certainly saw this also with my students. I have Christian students. Most of them are raised in Christian homes, and yet when they become seniors, they often struggle with a lot of anxiety, a lot of crippling anxiety about launching out into the world. And I felt that this was troubling, for a number of reasons, but one of which was that Christians ought to have a basis for their life that's not hinged upon having the right kind of career or life. And so I began to wonder, okay, what is it that's driving these students, that's giving them this great anxiety? And then, of course, a lot of people my own age are experiencing burnout. So I'm looking around and I'm seeing people desperate for methods to correct their lives. I'm seeing people who have a strong theological base, but at the same time feel deep existential dread or anxiety, sometimes cripplingly so. And so this book is an attempt to figure out how do we make sense of this? So that's one story about how this book. There are a couple of different stories, but that's one major theme.
Yeah. And so in the book, you contrast the idea from culture that we are our own
Yep.
with scripture's idea that we're not our own. Could you just unpack what are some differences between those two?
Yes. So as you said, really the premise of the book is that society is built on a false assumption of what it means to be a human. The society assumes that we are our own and we belong to ourselves, and there are implications to that. I think that of the strongest are implications on the way we think about identity and the way we think about belonging. So if we are our own, then when it comes to our identity, we're the only ones who can define who we are. And that process of defining can never reach an end point because there's no certain end point to be found. We're the only ones who can decide. And so the experience of being a modern person is perpetual identity crises, right? People are always feeling the need to reinvent themselves, to find the right kind of product that will solidify their identity. We're often pushed to express ourselves on social media endlessly in order to feel that we have some sort of affirmation that our identity is certain and secure and sure. That burden, what I call a responsibility of self-belonging, is a terrible burden to be under. And I see my students struggling with this, and actually all ages of people, I think, in the West deal with this burden, and it's exhausting. It's exhausting. There's this sense that you can never be satisfied, that you can never be content, you can never be sure you know who you are. So the other, belonging, we'll take belonging as another example of this. If we are our own and belong to ourselves, then we really don't belong anywhere. It's just wherever and to whomever we decide. So the example that I think is most helpful is there's a philosopher, a European philosopher named Zygmunt Bauman, who I love because his name is Zygmunt Bauman. And he talks about the way most modern relationships are until further notice. That's what he calls them, until further notice. So he says, people are married until further notice. You have children until further notice. We're best friends until further notice. There's this feeling that all relationships are fluid, that all belonging we have, I belong to my wife, I belong to my children, my neighbors, my church, all of those things are really just choices. They're choices I make. And so I can choose not to accept them or to accept them. But it's really only me who can make that decision. So those are some of the implications of if we are our own, we belong to ourselves. If the word of God is correct, and we are not our own, but we belong to Christ, then these things are radically changed. So, for example, my identity, I might feel that my identity is uncertain because society is constantly telling me that I have to express myself in order to have a solid identity. But the reality, the objective reality, is that I stand before a living, loving God who knows me exactly as I am. And so even though I feel uncertain, the reality is that my identity is sure in him. So that pressure to discover yourself or to become yourself, all those things are revealed to be illusions, myths that our culture teaches us. And similarly, if I belong to Christ, then that means that there are some kinds of belonging to, let's say, in relationships that are not elective. So, for example, when I make my vow to my wife, I belong to her, period. It's not a until further notice. It's a reality. I belong to my children and I have obligations toward them. I belong to the local church and I have obligations toward them. Creation also, I have, God's put me on the world. So part of my task is to be a good steward. So I belong to creation in a sense. So I think the result, to answer your question, the result of this different anthropology, this biblical anthropology, as opposed to our contemporary one, is that on the one hand, we're freed from these terrible burdens of having to make something of yourself and to have an identity and all these things. But on the other hand, we have to recognize that we have other burdens. The difference is that these burdens, like belonging to your family, are rightly designed by God and they are good for us and our neighbor, whereas the other ones are unbearable.
Yeah. Would some examples be, as I was reading your book, and you give a lot of examples in the culture of what this might look like. So would an example be in the culture of that I am my own, just the way that the conversation about sexuality and gender right now, and if so, how does that fit right into this idea that we are our own, we determine, our own reality, our own truth, and that sort of thing? How does that fit in?
So if we are our own, then we're the only ones able to and responsible for making our life matter. Okay. Now, that's a heavy weight to carry. It's a very heavy weight. And one of the ways we try to, in society in general, where we try to fulfill that duty, that obligation, that responsibility to make your life meaningful, is we think about the desires that are closest to our hearts. And so, and among those desires, sexual desires are near the top for most people. So if you find that you have, a desire for a person, and my life is up to me. I'm the only one who can make my life worthwhile. If that's true, then you're kind of a fool to not pursue that person. You're kind of a fool. So whether you're married, whether this is, a same-sex relationship, or a heterosexual relationship, or a committed relationship, or polygamous relationship, whatever it is, if you look inside yourself and you find this deep desire that says, like, that's the person who would make me complete, that's the experience or relationship that would make me complete. If we are our own, you're a fool for not pursuing that. Because you're the one at the end of the day who's going to have to look and say, my life was worthwhile. So if your family is hurt because you abandon your children to pursue an illicit affair, or, you abandon your wife, that's unfortunate. But really, you owe it to yourself to follow your heart. And I say this, and this to me is one of the most heartbreaking things, because I have seen it, I've witnessed it in people I know, friends who have made that very decision, and I have, abandoning a family because they really feel like, actually, this new person I met, that's when I look inside myself, that's who I really ought to be with. Meanwhile, I have other friends who are in what some call a mixed orientation marriage. So they're same-sex attracted, but they're married to a woman, and they have children, and they are faithful to their wives, and that's difficult. That's difficult for them. But what they've accepted is that that's what God calls them to, and they belong to their wife. And although they have some desires that feel really intense and maybe really personal, they're not their own. So they don't get to follow all those desires. So to answer your question, yes, a lot of the conversations we have about sex and gender, gender can get into a little bit, it's a slightly different thing, but when we talk about, sexual desires, to me, fundamentally, every one of us is going to have opportunities or times when we think, if I could just be with that person, then I would feel complete. And the question becomes, are you your own or not? If you are your own, then it makes perfect sense for you to pursue that regardless of the cost. But if you're not your own, then you have to put that desire to death. And you have to say, yeah, it would be nice to be with that person in some alternate universe, but I'm not. I'm with my wife, and that's good.
Yeah. And this idea is pervasive in the culture, isn't it? So as people watch this, listen to this, this is not some philosophical discussion that has no impact on somebody's daily life. This is virtually the air that we breathe. This idea that, like you even said a moment ago, just follow your heart, and those kind of things. Can you give some examples? I know that you talk a lot about pop culture, things like that. Where might we see things like this in pop culture?
The first thing that comes to mind, and this might be a strange, the social media platform I'm on most is Twitter, and so one of the things I find most fascinating is exploring subcultures that I'm not really familiar with it at all. So, for example, occasionally I'll come across a YouTuber. I don't watch YouTube at all, but I know that my students and a lot of young people follow specific personalities on YouTube, or pop artists that are, well, we would call them boy bands back in the 90s, but I don't know what they're called today. And so I'll discover one of these people, and I've never heard of them. I have no idea who they are, but they have like 2 million followers, and I think, okay, so clearly this person is impacting a lot of young people, even though I've never heard of them. And what I'll find is that they'll often make these sort of just random tweets, random comments, affirming this kind of thing, saying it's important to follow your dream, to not let other people define you, to allow your heart to guide you, messages like that. And then I'll sometimes see it on Instagram too, with life coaches and self-help gurus who essentially say the same thing. So it's I really do think it's. I saw recently in the first season of Ted Lasso, there's a divorce between Ted Lasso and his wife, and this divorce really troubles me because it's portrayed as kind of heroic, because she's crying and she doesn't want to end the marriage, but she really just feels like, I'm not in love with you anymore, and so I don't know how I fell out of love, but I'm not in love with you anymore. And he, again, the TV show presents him as being heroic by saying, well, I'm gonna respect you by, you know, saying, yeah, okay, well, then we can get a divorce. And so the sense here is that this woman has this experience. She has this feeling of not being in love. And the heroic thing is to affirm that and to say, yes, well, then if that's what your heart is telling you, then that's where you need to go. And again, that makes total sense. It is heroic for the husband to say that if we are our own,
Yeah.
right? Because you're saying, yeah, that's right, follow that. But we're not.
Hmm. And but that kind of thinking, pervasive in the culture, makes its way into the church.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so how has this even made its way into the church?
So I think if we step back and watch, we can find it show up in a myriad of ways. And this is one of the reasons that I wrote the book, is that um, I do talk about sex and pornography in the book a bit, but and that is, I think, probably the most clear way these differing ideologies appear in contemporary culture. But my concern is that we latch onto those so much that we don't see the deeper ways that we've already accepted that we are our own. So for example, we might look at the person in a church who leaves their spouse and kids to follow their heart, and we might say, well, it's immoral for them to believe that they're their own. They actually belong to their spouse and children, and we would be right to say this. But we would also turn to young people in the church who are deciding to pursue a career, and the reasons they're pursuing that career are entirely tied to their hearts, right? So I want to have this kind of career because I'm my own person. So I have no responsibility to stay in my community. I have no responsibility to ask, what does my neighbor need and how can I use my talents and skills to help my neighbor in that way? I am free to move wherever I want and do whatever I want. I'm also not concerned. I don't have to be concerned with how my job might affect the customers, right? So what effect is this having on the customers or on God's creation? Really, I just have to ask, is this fulfilling to me? Is this me pursuing this life that I want? And if it is, then that's enough. So we can do this all over the place. We'll do this with churches. We'll say, I just really don't feel like this church is a good fit for me anymore. Now, there are good reasons to leave a church. Don't get me wrong, but when we take that perspective that I don't need to sacrifice for my local congregation. I don't need to set my preferences aside for my local congregation. I'm just going to find one that I feel comfortable in, where I fit in. Really, what we're saying is, I only belong to a church when I choose to belong. So yeah, I think it's deeply embedded and ingrained in our thinking, in our society.
Yeah, I mean, when I was reading your book, just thinking about how the church has been discipled really to think the way that you just described. I can see a lot of people even listening to the way that you talk about, you gave that example of just that young person going to pursue that career, and based on all of those reasons, and so many people in the church, what's wrong with that? That's how I live my life.
Yeah. Yep. That's probably true. And I should say that in this, I'm coming off as judgmental, but I do try to be careful in the book to to be clear that I'm plagued by these same things. Like I've grown up in this society too.
Yeah.
I have this baggage. I have this thinking, and I have to work actively on calling it out. Let me give you a quick example of this. A couple of years ago, my wife, who has 2 master's degrees, was not able to get a job in this technical field that she wanted to get a job in, because we live in Shawnee, Oklahoma. And so she was staying home with the kids, which is wonderful. And I want to point out that a parent staying home with their children is a pretty darn natural thing. If you think about how God designed us, caring for your children is like one of the most human things you can possibly do, right? And yet, when my wife would meet new adults, one of the first things they would ask is, "What do you do? What do you do?" And when she said, "Well, I stay home with the kids," Now that person might reply very kindly, like, "Oh, that's really great." But then they follow up with, "What does your husband do?" Right? And the implication is like, okay, I have to gesture to the fact that it's good that you stay home with your kids, but really, I have nothing to say to you now.
Mm,
You're boring. Your life, in effect, is on pause. You're not doing anything meaningful because you're not working. So what's interesting about that dynamic is here, my wife knew that's nonsense, right? Like
mhm,
she knows, okay, my self-worth, my identity is not determined by whether or not I have a career. But it's important to note that even when you can recognize that social lie, you still feel the effects of it upon you. When people keep treating you as less than fully human because you don't have a career, even though you know they're wrong, it still weighs on you. And I think that's
mm.
important. As a part of this book is pointing that out. We can't just have the right frame of mind and then everything goes away. No, we're still going to suffer from the effects.
Yeah. And so what does that mean for the church? What does it mean for the church when so much of the way that we think and live our lives is we've been shaped by a way that's just contrary to the gospel of, you know, because as I listen to you talk, some people might think, oh man, this is really radical, this idea. What's wrong with just the way that, just doing what, everybody else does and, following our hearts and those kind of things. And, but really all you're saying is the gospel. I mean,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
it's almost this difference between the American gospel and the biblical gospel.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. And part of the difficulty is that we can corner or box the gospel into a very Sunday morning or a spiritual sense. So I'm spiritually saved, but the lordship of Christ isn't something that impacts us day to day to day, right? And so, you know, part of the work of sanctification is living out and discovering and practicing what it means to accept the lordship of Christ in every sphere of our lives. So to answer your question, what can the churches do? I man, I so what I would love if churches were seen as these places of refuge. Like
Mm,
if people knew, man, those Christians, they know, for example, they know how to rest. Because the thing is, when you are your own, you cannot rest. If you stop, if you take a break and really rest, then you're falling behind and somebody's going to get ahead and you're losing your identity and you're losing your place in life. But if you're not your own, if your being in the world is sustained by a loving God, then you can totally rest. Like on Sundays, you can just rest and not rest so that you can be more efficient on Monday. Because that's usually how we talk about rest. Like, oh yeah, I've got a nap so I can wake up and do more labor, so that I can feel that my life is going someplace. But just one small thing, if the church could be known as a place where people really rest and they feast, and those feasts are abundance, they're overflowing, they are not always efficient, but they're a way of celebrating the fact that God is the one that provides, not us. Those things I think would be powerful. But I also think we need to just on the local church level think through this. So the example I gave earlier about young people and encouraging them to get careers, I would pursue different careers. I would love it if the norm became in churches that older people who are mentoring younger people would encourage them to stop and ask the question, what does my immediate community need?
mm,
One of the examples I give in the book is that sometimes young people, not just young people, sometimes people will feel that a truly sacrificial or moral or just or admirable career would be teaching or missionary or a minister or a doctor or something. But I think we need to ask the question, what does our community need? It may be that your community doesn't need another pastor.
mm.
Like maybe it doesn't need another doctor, but maybe it needs someone who's a really good plumber, or maybe it needs someone who has a 9 to 5 job but mentors teenagers in youth group every week, right? So if we could have that be a norm, I think that would be just one of many different examples of how the church could stand out against this idea of being your own. And it would be a relief too. It's like you'd be relieving people from a terrible burden.
Yeah. You know, that's such a beautiful picture that you just painted there. And the thing about podcasts is somebody could come along years from now and listen to it, and not be aware of the moment that we're in. So here we are, we're in September 2021. COVID is still raging, and political division, racial tension, and there's just division on all kinds of different levels. I would love to hear you paint a picture. What would that church's refuge look like in a moment we are in right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, give me a second here. That's a good question. So I would say part of it, so one step would be thinking about the needs of the people in our local congregations, because we have a tendency, maybe particularly Americans who have been here for several generations, have a tendency to expect people to take care of themselves. So when somebody is sick, or when somebody is experiencing loneliness or isolation, which is a lot of people right now, the expectation is, well, if they really need help, they can contact the pastor or the deacons, or they can ask for help. But otherwise, it's none of my business. Like, everybody just needs to take care of their own thing, and that's it. Well, if we're not our own, then we need to look for the interest of others, and we need to be seeking that out. And when we know that an entire society is suffering from loneliness, from fatigue, from stress, from anxiety, from COVID, then we need to be proactive. Our churches should be places where people are being proactive. I do think that, accepting that you're not your own means that sometimes you follow government mandates about how to curb a pandemic, even if you're not convinced that they're the best, because you accept that, my responsibility is to my neighbor, and right now these are the governing authorities God has given me. Now, that doesn't mean that there are certain lines that can't be crossed, that shouldn't be crossed, constitutional lines, but our posture should not be one focusing on our personal rights. First of all, our posture should be one of how do I love my neighbor, who I have an obligation to? Like, I have an obligation to make sure that Shawnee doesn't have a COVID outbreak. I can't control it, but I do have opportunities to affect it by wearing masks, by being vaccinated. And maybe I don't think that's a big deal. Maybe I won't get, seriously ill if I get COVID again. But I have an obligation to them, and that's a very real obligation that I have to take seriously.
Yeah. What does it say about this moment we're in, where even just talking about the obligation to my neighbor just seems to be off the radar? So much of the discussion happening in the church right now.
Yeah, and so part of this is, you mentioned earlier just how divided we are. And one of the things that I've witnessed is that when people, let's say on vaccines, people who are pushing vaccines, which I highly recommend, sometimes they'll say, you're not loving your neighbor if you don't get vaccinated. And I don't necessarily disagree with that logic. But the problem is that we don't really use that language of loving our neighbor very consistently. And so when it only comes up in a culture war, because unfortunately, we've made the pandemic a part of the culture war, when it only comes up as a piece of evidence or a moral argument for your stance on the culture war, then the other side, other people are going to be very suspicious, and they're going to think this really isn't about loving the neighbor. This is about you pushing your agenda. So I think we have to be judicial. We have to be careful and discerning about the way we use language, because, and it's a shame that we do, but people have, inside the church and outside the church, have co-opted, have taken these deep Christian virtues and traditions and obligations, and they have weaponized them for different policies and different agendas. And I think we have to be sensitive. We have to recognize that some of the people who are listening to us, when they hear us say, "Are you loving your neighbor?" they hear, "Oh, well, this is a political agenda that you're just pushing, and you're just dressing it up. You're baptizing it." So, I mean, to me, that practically means, well, I have to live it. Like, I have to walk the walk. If when I say to someone, okay, you have an obligation to your neighbor to love them, to care for their well-being, and to serve them. And that person recognizes that I live that out in my life, not just in my pet political, things, but consistently. Then I think they can hear what I'm saying, not as a skirmish in the culture war, but as a genuine, responsibility and implication of being a Christian, an implication of the gospel. So it's hard. That division just makes so many things so much harder. That's
Mm.
it's tough.
Yeah. In the book, one of the ways that you talk about how churches can avoid just going with the culture's flow on this idea that we are our own is you talk about rejecting it, just deliberately, intentionally, rejection. You even use the language, just calling it out. I would love to hear you flesh that out, unpack that a little bit more. What would that look like to just intentionally reject this?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, I gave that example of the, fairly popular Apple TV show Ted Lasso, where
Mhm.
a lot of people are praising it, loving it because it's a very uplifting show and it's very positive, and the characters are just a kind man and he's moral. And so when people think of the show, it's not just that it's enjoyable, but the main character seems to embody a kind of uh, a virtuous life that we feel is lacking in the contemporary world. And so that's why I think he's resonating with a lot of people. And yet, right in the center of the first season, part of his virtuous life means that he has to take what I would say is a liberal, not in a political liberal, but a liberal in a do whatever you want stance. Position by saying to his wife, well, if you don't feel like you should be married to me anymore, let's not try to work it out. Let's not set aside our personal preferences for the good of our child, for example. You do you. I'm going to set you free so you can follow what you desire. So there's an example of something in our culture that we can point to and say, all right, let's look at what this actually means, okay? Because we can just see this scene in the show and not pull it apart and just accept, wow, he's really being a nice guy. He's not making a big deal out about his wife wanting to leave him. Well, but if we belong to each other in marriage, if those vows really mean something, maybe it would be better for him to urge her to keep trying to keep this relationship working. So I think I think that's an example of it. I think it's important to do this with our children, Disney movies or whatever, observing when these kinds of messages are communicated and criticizing them, calling them out. Um, but also, I think we have to encourage one another. So I gave that
Mm.
earlier example of my wife hearing from people kind of dismissively, oh, so what does your husband do? Right. So part of my task in loving her is being that voice of encouragement and reminding her, okay, that ideology that you're really only a true self if you have a successful career, that that's a lie. So I'm going to encourage you to believe that, right? And so just encouraging each other with good words. I think when these things happen, I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah. Alan, man, you've been so gracious with your time. I just want to ask you one more question
Yep.
here before we wrap up our interview. When I read your book, man, I was really hopeful for the future of the church. So much of the conversation now is the church in the West doesn't seem to have much of a future. There's just a lot of dark conversation happening
Yeah.
online. What's the future of the church? Not a lot of hope. But when I finished your book, I walked away really
Hmm.
hopeful because I felt like there was a compelling vision here
Mm.
for the church to live in a different way.
Wow.
And I would love for you just to speak on that for a minute. What do you think? What do you think this might? Because you do have the ear of pastors and church leaders. A good chunk of our listeners are leaders in churches. They serve in churches, and I would love to hear you just paint that picture of what could this mean for the future of the church if we were to begin to embody this, make it a serious part of our discipleship, that we are not our own.
Man, so yeah, this is I'm so glad. That is very 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 encouraging. I did not think expect to hear that from someone, but that's really encouraging, because you're right. It is so easy to get discouraged. The denominations splitting apart or almost splitting apart, and just so much division. It's painful. So, the posture that I take at the end of the book is one of radical trust that God is the one who redeems the world and who redeems people and who saves cities like Nineveh, not us. But and so one thing that means is that we should avoid these sort of grand visions of I'm saving America, or here's my 10 steps to save my country or to redeem my country, or these sorts of things, because very often, and this is very much a part of the wider social attitude that it's secular, it's everywhere, and the church has adopted it. We kind of feel like if there's a problem in society, I can't address it unless I have a plan to defeat it, right? So like, if there's a problem, I've got to, I can't just faithfully face it. I have to have a plan to overcome it. And I want to say that some problems in life, and including the problems we've described, which are so deeply ingrained in our society, 10-step plans don't work. 10-step plans don't work. So on the one hand, we have to radically trust. I talk about this line from T.S. Eliot where he describes, in a society that's progressing backwards, advancing progressively backwards, what we have to do is hold out our hands with palms upward, receiving God's mercy, God's power, God's wisdom. So I would love to see a movement, but when we typically think about movements, we think about, okay, we're going to radically change things. Well, let's just think about being faithful. That's it. If we had the perspective, okay, I'm not going to feel discouraged when being faithful doesn't change my city. I'm not going to be discouraged when being faithful doesn't, change my federal or state government or even my church congregation. My task before God is to be faithful, is to stand in the city and be a voice proclaiming, we are not our own, we belong to Christ, we are dependent upon him, and therefore we should be grateful and thankful to him and follow him. And if we can do that, I think it has, I'm glad you framed this in terms of, the future of the church, because I don't know, I cannot envision how our own country, America, or even the West turns around from this. I literally just can't envision it. But as I say in the book, thankfully, I'm not in charge. Like God's in charge. So it doesn't really matter what I can envision, because God has already told me what I have to do. And God has already told you and everyone listening to this what they have to do. We have to be faithful where we are. And that's it. That's what we have to do. And I think if we can do that, there will be pockets of loving, gracious resistance to a toxic culture that will be a refuge that people will want to turn to, desire to turn to, because they need that rest. That would be the vision I have. Maybe the church, fewer people are attending church in the future, and so on. Maybe denominations shrink, but man, if we could have churches that were really outposts, that really represented God in the midst of a city, that would be beautiful.
Yeah, that's all. And man, it's beautiful. It's powerful. Powerful. Hey, Alan, how can people connect with you online? We're going to link to the book. You Are Not Your Own. We'll link to it in the show notes. People can, right now, when this is recorded, they can pre-order it. But people can check the show notes. They can purchase the book, pre-order it before it releases. But Alan, where can they find more of your work online?
So my website is oalannoble.com, ALANNOBLE.com, oalannoble.com. So you can find stuff there. You can find me on Twitter at the Alan Noble, I think. It sounds plausible. So yeah. Be happy to connect with people.
Awesome. Hey, great. Hey, Alan, thanks so much for taking the time. This has been great to talk to you.
Thank you.